The attics, basements, and forgotten closets of Black homes from the 1970s continue to reveal treasures that museums, collectors, and historians are eager to obtain. These are not just valuable objects, but cultural artifacts documenting a period when African American communities asserted their identities, reclaimed their heritage, and created artworks that were initially rejected by mainstream culture but are now recognized as important American works. Here are 10 more treasures from Black families' homes that seemed ordinary in the 1970s but are now sold at extraordinary prices by collectors. Each represents a piece of history preserved by families who were unaware they were safeguarding their cultural heritage. Which one was in your house? 1. Vintage Teak and Afrocentric furniture set. Black families in the 1970s furnished their homes with teak wood furniture featuring African-inspired carvings, woven cane backing, and designs that reflected the era's embrace of African heritage and modern aesthetic. These furniture sets, including dining tables, chairs, sideboards, and bedroom suites, combined Scandinavian mid-century modern influences with Afrocentric decorative elements, creating a distinctive style that defined Black middle-class homes during that decade. The thing nobody tells you is that authentic 1970s teak furniture in good condition now sells for thousands of dollars to collectors who recognize both its aesthetic value and its cultural significance as physical manifestation of Black pride and African identity reclamation. Families who kept these heavy, solid wood pieces through decades of changing trends are discovering that what once seemed like dated furniture has become highly sought-after vintage treasure. What many overlook is that furniture featuring hand-carved African motifs, masks, or geometric patterns inspired by African textiles commands premium prices beyond standard mid-century pieces because it represents specific cultural moment when Black Americans were actively connecting with ancestral roots. Dining room sets where families gathered for Sunday dinners, bedroom suites that witnessed generations of children growing up, and living room pieces that hosted civil rights discussions have appreciated not just as furniture, but as artifacts of Black domestic life during transformative times. Original upholstery, even if worn, adds value when it features African-inspired fabrics in earth tones, oranges, and browns that defined 1970s color palettes. Museums and cultural institutions actively seek these pieces for permanent collections, competing with private collectors who want to own tangible pieces of Black aesthetic history. Does your family still have any original 1970s furniture? And do you remember the African-inspired design elements that made it special? 2. Original Blacklight posters and velvet art. The fluorescent posters that glowed under black lights and the velvet paintings featuring African queens, Black Panthers, and cultural icons that decorated bedroom walls throughout Black households in the 1970s have become collectible art worth hundreds or thousands of dollars, depending on subject matter and condition. These weren't fine art in the traditional sense, but popular culture expressions that let Black families affordably decorate with images reflecting their identity, politics, and cultural pride during an era when mainstream art world largely ignored Black subjects. The thing nobody tells you is that original Blacklight posters, particularly those featuring African imagery, Black power symbols, or political messages, are now sought by collectors of 1970s memorabilia and African American cultural artifacts. Velvet paintings of African queens with elaborate jewelry and headdresses, Black Jesus images, and portraits of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. that once cost under $10 at flea markets now sell for hundreds when they're vintage originals in good condition. What many overlook is that provenance matters. Posters and paintings that can be documented as having hung in specific homes, particularly those of activists or cultural figures, command even higher prices from collectors and museums. These decorative pieces documented how Black families chose to surround themselves with affirming imagery during an era when mainstream media still largely excluded or stereotyped Black people. The psychedelic aesthetic combined with African and political themes created unique art form that captured the specific cultural moment of Black consciousness, merging with 1970s visual style. Families who kept these posters rolled in closets or stored velvet paintings in attics are discovering their cultural and monetary value. What images decorated your bedroom walls during the 1970s, and do you still have any of those posters or paintings? 3. Complete sets of Jet magazine mini issues and pocket editions. While regular issues of Jet magazine are valuable, the pocket-sized mini editions and special commemorative issues that Black families collected and saved have become particularly sought after by collectors building comprehensive archives of Black media history. These smaller format magazines fit in purses and pockets, making them accessible. Reading that Black professionals and travelers carried everywhere, documenting their journeys and daily lives in ways the full-sized issues couldn't. The thing nobody tells you is that complete runs of these mini editions, especially those covering specific years or historic events, sell for substantial sums to collectors and institutions that recognize them as unique documentation of Black life, designed for on-the-go consumption. Special issues commemorating historic events, featuring specific celebrities at peak fame, or documenting cultural moments now recognized as pivotal command premium prices from collectors. What many overlook is that the mini format meant these magazines were more likely to be carried, read repeatedly, and ultimately lost or discarded, making surviving examples in good condition increasingly rare and valuable. Families who saved these smaller magazines, often in boxes or drawers where they accumulated over years, are holding archives that researchers and collectors desperately want to access and preserve. The advertisements alone document Black consumer culture and the businesses that served Black communities, making even common issues valuable for research purposes beyond just the editorial content. Did your family save the Mini Jet magazines, and do you remember carrying them in purses or pockets? 4. Vintage Shag carpet samples and fabric swatches from Black-owned businesses. Original Shag carpet samples, fabric swatches, and interior design materials from Black-owned carpet stores, furniture shops, and decorating businesses that served Black communities during the 1970s have become collectible items documenting Black entrepreneurship and the distinctive aesthetic preferences of that era. These business samples, often featuring the deep oranges, browns, golds, and earth tones that defined 1970s decor, represent both design history and economic history of Black-owned businesses that thrived by serving communities often ignored by mainstream retailers. The thing nobody tells you is that textile and design museums actively collect these samples as documentation of popular taste and commercial practices during specific historical periods, with materials from Black-owned businesses being particularly valuable for documenting underrepresented business history. Carpet samples showing the long pile shag carpeting that was status symbol in Black homes. Fabric swatches from furniture upholstery featuring African-inspired patterns, and wallpaper samples in the bold geometric designs that adorned accent walls all document the aesthetic that Black families chose for their homes. What many overlook is that these samples often included business information, store name, addresses, phone numbers that now serve as documentation of Black business districts and commercial enterprises that no longer exist. Families who kept sample books from when they redecorated during the 1970s are holding physical archives of Black entrepreneurship and consumer culture that historians and collectors recognize as valuable primary sources. The materials themselves, actual fabrics, carpet fibers, wallpapers, provide tangible connection to how Black homes looked, felt, and expressed the pride and optimism of that era. Do you remember the colors and textures that defined Black homes in the 1970s? And did your family keep any samples from decorating projects? 5. Original Dashiki patterns and African clothing design books. Sewing patterns for Dashikis, African-inspired garments, and the specialized books that taught Black seamstresses how to create African clothing at home have become collectible items worth hundreds of dollars to fashion historians and collectors of Black cultural material. During the 1970s, many Black families couldn't afford to purchase expensive African clothing, so mothers and grandmothers learned to sew their own, using patterns specifically designed for creating authentic or African-inspired garments. The thing nobody tells you is that these sewing patterns, particularly those from Black-owned pattern companies or those specifically marketed to Black consumers, are now rare because they were meant to be used, cut apart, and discarded after serving their purpose. Families who saved unused patterns in original envelopes or who kept the instruction books that accompanied them are holding valuable documentation of how Black families created their own cultural expressions through homemade clothing. What many overlook is that books teaching African garment construction, including detailed instructions for creating authentic patterns and selecting appropriate fabrics, are sought by fashion historians studying how African clothing was adapted and adopted in America during the Black consciousness era. These materials documented the DIY aspect of Black cultural expression. Families who couldn't afford to buy African imports created their own versions, maintaining aesthetic integrity while adapting techniques to available materials and skills. Original patterns for children's dashikis, women's wrap dresses inspired by African styles, and men's African shirts that were sewn and worn for special occasions represent both fashion history and cultural history. Did someone in your family sew African-inspired clothing during the 1970s? And were there specific patterns or books they used? 6. Vintage Black family Bibles with genealogical records. Large family Bibles published during the 1970s specifically for Black families, particularly those featuring African-American religious imagery and biblical figures depicted with Black features, have become valuable both as religious artifacts and as genealogical documents recording family histories. These weren't ordinary Bibles, but specially designed publications that affirmed Black religious identity while providing sections for recording birth, deaths, marriages, and family trees that many Black families maintained meticulously. The thing nobody tells you is that these Bibles, especially those with extensive family records filled in over decades, are valuable to genealogists, historians, and family researchers because they often contain the only written documentation of family histories that weren't recorded in official records that excluded or marginalized Black people. Families who maintained these Bibles and passed them through generations are holding irreplaceable archives of their own histories, documents that cannot be recreated and that have both sentimental and monetary value. What many overlook is that the Bibles themselves, with their distinctive designs featuring Black religious imagery and their specific publication details, are collectible as religious artifacts that document how Black Christianity expressed itself visually during the 1970s. Publishers who created these specialized Bibles often included additional content relevant to Black religious experiences, making them valuable to scholars studying Black religion and culture beyond just the genealogical records they contain. The combination of religious artifact and family archive makes these Bibles particularly valuable to descendants seeking to understand their roots and to institutions documenting Black family structures and religious practices. Does your family have a Bible with genealogical records, and how many generations of family history does it document? 7. Complete collections of Black greeting cards and stationery. During the 1970s, companies began producing greeting cards featuring Black families, couples, and cultural imagery specifically designed for Black consumers who wanted cards that reflected their own experiences and appearances. Families who saved birthday cards, Christmas cards, and special occasion greetings from this era, particularly complete examples showing both the illustration and the message inside, are holding collectible items that document visual representation and consumer culture. The thing nobody tells you is that vintage Black greeting cards, especially those from pioneering Black-owned card companies or early mainstream attempts at inclusive products, sell for significant amounts to collectors of paper, ephemera, and Black cultural material. Cards featuring natural hairstyles, African-inspired clothing, and Black families in middle-class domestic settings documented the aesthetic preferences and self-image that Black consumers wanted to see reflected in products they purchased. What many overlook is that the messages inside these cards, the language, the cultural references, the specific expressions of love, celebration, or sympathy provide linguistic and cultural documentation beyond just the visual imagery that makes them valuable to researchers. Families saved cards in shoe boxes and drawers, creating unintentional archives of visual culture and commercial products that are now recognized as important documentation of representation and consumer empowerment. art. Certain designs featuring specific artists' work or innovative concepts are particularly valuable, with collectors actively seeking examples from specific companies or time periods to complete their collections. Did your family save greeting cards, and do you remember seeing cards that specifically reflected Black families and culture? 8. Vintage macrame plant hangers and craft items. The macrame plant hangers that held spider plants and ferns near windows in Black homes throughout the 1970s, particularly those in the orange, brown, and earth tone color schemes that dominated that era's decor, have become collectible craft items representing both the DIY culture and the specific aesthetic that defined the decade. Many of these hangers were handmade by family members, following patterns from craft books and magazines, making each one unique while sharing the distinctive macrame style that was ubiquitous during that period. The thing nobody tells you is that handmade macrame items from the 1970s, particularly those with complex knotting patterns, unusual designs, or that incorporate wooden beads and other period-appropriate embellishments, are sought by collectors of 1970s decor and craft history. Families who kept these plant hangers stored away after plants died or tastes changed are discovering that what seemed like outdated craft projects are now vintage decor items that command good prices from collectors recreating authentic 1970s interiors. What many overlook is that the craft books and pattern instructions for making macrame are themselves collectible, particularly those specifically marketed to Black consumers or featuring Black crafters and homes in their illustrations. The DIY aspect of these items makes them particularly valuable when they come with documentation of who made them and when, turning them from generic craft items into family artifacts that document both artistic expression and domestic culture. Museums collecting 1970s material culture and craft history actively seek these examples to preserve. Did someone in your family make macrame plant hangers, and do any survive from that era? 9. Black-owned business directories and community resource guides. Printed directories listing Black-owned businesses, community organizations, and cultural resources from specific cities during the 1970s have become valuable archival materials documenting Black economic networks and community institutions that often no longer exist. These directories, sometimes published by churches, community organizations, or entrepreneurial individuals, provided essential information about where Black consumers could find Black-owned services, while documenting the breadth of Black business ownership during that era. The thing nobody tells you is that researchers, historians, and genealogists actively seek these directories because they provide documentation of Black businesses, professional services, and community organizations that left few other records and that help reconstruct the economic and social landscapes of Black communities. Families who kept these directories for reference are holding valuable primary sources that cannot be found in mainstream business directories or phone books that rarely differentiated Black-owned establishments. What many overlook is that these directories often included additional content, essays about Black economic empowerment, advertisements featuring period-specific imagery and language, and photographs of business owners and establishments that provide rich documentation beyond just the business listings themselves. The directories serve as snapshots of specific communities at specific moments, documenting which neighborhoods had concentrations of Black businesses and what types of services were available, information crucial for understanding urban Black history. Libraries and archives actively collect these materials, while descendants use them to research family business histories and community contexts. Did your family keep business directories or community guides, and do you remember consulting them to find Black-owned services? 10. Vintage children's books featuring Black protagonists. During the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, publishers began producing children's books specifically featuring Black characters, families, and cultural experiences. Books that Black parents eagerly purchased to provide their children with representation that mainstream children's literature had almost entirely excluded. First editions and early printings of these pioneering books in good condition are now valuable collectibles sought by libraries building diverse collections, collectors of children's literature, and institutions documenting Black childhood and representation. The thing nobody tells you is that certain titles, particularly first editions of books that became classics or that were written by now celebrated Black authors early in their careers, can sell for hundreds or thousands of dollars depending on condition and rarity. Families who read these books books to their children during the 1970s and saved them rather than discarding them after kids outgrew them are holding valuable first editions that documented the beginning of consistent Black representation in children's publishing. What many overlook is that even common titles have research value as documentation of how Black childhood was portrayed, what messages Black parents wanted their children to receive, and how publishers approached the emerging market for Black children's literature. Books featuring natural hairstyles, African American vernacular, urban settings familiar to Black children, and storylines addressing racism or celebrating Black culture are particularly sought after. The dust jackets are crucial to value. Books without original jackets are worth significantly less, making careful preservation important. What children's books featuring Black characters do you remember from the 1970s, and did your family keep them? These 10 additional treasures from Black homes in the 1970s remind us that cultural heritage takes countless forms, from the furniture families gathered around to the cards they sent each other, from the clothes they sewed to the books they read to their children. What seemed ordinary during that decade now represents irreplaceable documentation of how Black families lived, what they valued, and how they expressed themselves during a time of tremendous cultural change and assertion of identity. The monetary value collectors place on these items reflects growing recognition that African American cultural history deserves preservation and study, that the material culture of Black domestic life matters as much as the artifacts of famous figures or major events. For Black families discovering that their kept possessions have become valuable, the decision of whether to sell or preserve these items is deeply personal, balancing financial considerations against the desire to maintain family heritage and cultural connections. What's certain is that these objects, whether they remain in family hands or enter museum collections, represent pieces of American history that cannot be replaced if lost, making their preservation crucial regardless of where they ultimately reside. The treasures hidden in Black homes from the 1970s continue emerging, each one adding to our understanding of that pivotal decade and the families who lived through it with pride, creativity, and determination to create lives that reflected their own beauty and worth. If you want to take a trip down memory lane, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like my